Lars Petrovich didn't believe in ghosts. He barely believed in luck, fate, or karma, and he sure as hell didn't believe in things that went bump in the night. Life had already thrown enough real horrors his way. A cheating ex, a job that barely covered rent, and a growing pit in his stomach that whispered, "This is it. This is all your life will ever be." So, when he moved into Holloway Arms, a run-down apartment complex on the edge of nowhere, he didn't flinch at the dim hallways or the peeling wallpaper curling like dead skin. The air smelled like old wood and something vaguely metallic, but the rent was cheap, and nobody asked questions. That was enough for him. Still, something felt off. His new place, apartment 2C, was a one-bedroom unit with beige walls that had gone grey with age. The carpet was an itchy, stained mess of cigarette burns and God knows. A single overhead light buzzed faintly, casting jittery shadows on the ceiling. Lars dropped his duffel bag on the kitchen counter and exhaled, surveying the space. Home sweet home. The previous tenant had left behind a few things: an old coat hanging in the closet, a single fork in a drawer, and a refrigerator that hummed like it was struggling to stay alive. He checked inside and found a single can of Hanson's cream soda, unopened. Weird. He grabbed the can, rolling the cool aluminum between his fingers. The expiration date had long passed, but something about it unsettled him. Why just one can? Why not throw it away? Lars shook off the thought and opened the fridge door wider, letting the light spill across the floor. That's when he noticed something. In the far right corner of the kitchen, just past the fridge, a section of the baseboard was missing. The darkness beyond it was deep, like a hole leading somewhere it shouldn't. A chill ran up his arms. "Great," he muttered, closing the fridge and stepping back. First day in, and the place already has secret tunnels. He made a mental note to shove something in the gap later. For now, he was exhausted. Lars slept hard, the kind of sleep that drags you under like a stone in a lake, drowning out the world until nothing exists. No dreams, no memories, just blank silence. Until, knock, knock, knock. His eyes snapped open. The sound was soft but deliberate. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, echoing through the quiet of his apartment. Lars lay still, listening. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. Did someone just? Then, knock, knock, knock. He turned his head toward the front door. The red numbers on his bedside clock blinked. 3:33 a.m. A strange unease settled over him. He wasn't expecting anyone. He didn't even know his neighbors yet. Who the hell knocks on a stranger's door at this hour? Sliding out of bed, he crept to the door, pressing his eye to the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim yellow glow of a single flickering light. Lars hesitated, then reached for the lock. Knock, knock, knock. He jumped back. The sound was right there, inches away. It didn't sound muffled, like someone knocking from the outside. It sounded closer, like it was coming from inside the apartment. His breath caught. That was impossible. He was alone. He had checked every room before bed. Hadn't he? Slowly, Lars turned his head toward the kitchen. The fridge hummed quietly. The room sat in darkness, except for a sliver of light stretching from the window. And that's when he saw it. The gap in the baseboard. The opening was wider than before. Something inside shifted. A whisper of movement, so soft he almost didn't hear it. Lars felt ice crawl up his spine. No, absolutely not. He wasn't dealing with this at 3:33 in the goddamn morning. Without another glance, he turned, climbed back into bed, and yanked the covers over his head like a 5-year-old hiding from the boogeyman. The knocking didn't come again, but Lars barely slept. Sunlight slashed through the blinds when Lars finally rolled out of bed. His body ached from tension. For a second, he wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing, but as he made his way to the kitchen, his stomach dropped. The baseboard gap was still there. It looked wider. He swallowed hard and knelt down, peering inside. The darkness beyond the opening was impenetrable. Just a hole, he told himself. Probably leads under the building or something. Rats. Definitely rats. He reached for his phone, intending to call maintenance, only to realize there was no contact number for the landlord. The lease agreement just said, "Mr. Greaves will be in touch." Right. A quick Google search for Holloway Arms pulled up nothing. No website. No reviews. No records of past tenants. That was weird, wasn't it? A pit formed in his stomach. He shoved an old towel into the hole and stood up quickly, brushing off his hands. Problem solved. Or so he thought. On his way out for groceries, Lars nearly bumped into his neighbor, an elderly woman in a faded floral robe. She gasped, pressing a frail hand to her chest. "You startled me." "Sorry." Lars forced a smile. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." She stared at him for a long moment, her clouded eyes flicking toward his door. "You're the new tenant in 2C, she murmured. "Yeah, just moved in." Mrs. Vang's lips pursed. "Did you hear it?" Lars hesitated. "Hear what?" Her gaze darkened. "The knocking." His skin prickled. "Yeah, actually, I did." Her expression didn't change. "Don't open the door." A cold knot tightened in his stomach. "What happens if I do?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer. Instead, she gave him a long, searching look, then shuffled back into her apartment without another word. Lars stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. What the hell kind of place had he moved into? Lars went to bed with a heavy feeling in his chest. He hadn't stopped thinking about Mrs. Vang's warning. He left the hallway light on, just in case. The night stretched on. Silence pressed against the walls. Then, knock, knock, knock. His eyes flew open. 3:33 a.m. He squeezed his eyes shut. Ignore it. Just ignore it. But this time, the knocking didn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. It was getting louder. His heart pounded as he threw the blankets aside and marched to the door. If this was some prank he was going to, he stopped dead. The door handle was turning. Lars stumbled back, breath catching in his throat. And then, just as suddenly, silence. He stared at the door, his own ragged breathing the only sound in the room. Minutes passed. Nothing. Finally, he reached for the peephole, hesitant. His fingers trembled as he pressed his eye to the glass. The hallway was empty, but something was wrong. The overhead light was flickering, casting shadows that didn't move with the walls. And then he saw it. A shape. A tall, thin figure standing just outside the range of the flickering light. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But somehow Lars knew. It was looking right at him. Lars didn't move. His breath sat like a stone in his throat, and his pulse thumped so hard he swore the thing in the hallway could hear it. Through the peephole, the figure remained still. It stood just outside the reach of the flickering hallway light, a tall, unmoving silhouette. Lars squinted, trying to make out any details. Was it a person? A trick of the shadows? His own reflection playing games with his half-asleep brain? Then, as the overhead light flickered one last time, the shape vanished. Not walked away, not moved out of view, just gone. Lars staggered backward from the door, his skin crawling with a primal instinct to run. But where? He was already home, and now he wasn't sure if that was even safe. He took deep, controlled breaths, rubbing a hand over his face. Think. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe his brain was still foggy from sleep. Maybe. Knock. Lars sucked in a sharp breath. This time, it didn't come from the door. It came from inside the apartment. Lars barely slept. He must have dozed off at some point, because when his eyes snapped open again, sunlight was spilling through the blinds, and the clock read 7:42 a.m. His whole body ached, stiff from hours of tension. The knocking never returned after that last time. The figure never reappeared. But he hadn't forgotten. Dragging himself out of bed, Lars padded toward the front door and checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. No weird shapes. No lingering shadows. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. What the hell is going on in this place? As he turned to head to the bathroom, something caught his eye. Something wrong. The towel he'd stuffed into the baseboard gap was gone. In its place, the opening was even wider. A sliver of black space yawned from the gap, like a mouth slightly open, waiting. Lars crouched, squinting into the darkness. His own breath felt too loud in the small kitchen. He reached out hesitantly, fingers brushing against the edges of the opening. The wood was cold, colder than it should have been. Then, something moved inside the gap. Lars jerked away, heart slamming into his ribs. He scrambled backward, hitting the fridge, eyes locked onto the hole. A faint, rasping sound echoed from inside. Breathing. Deep, slow, controlled. Something was down there. Lars lunged for the nearest drawer, fumbling for anything sharp. He grabbed a rusted steak knife left behind by the last tenant, his breath coming in short bursts. The breathing stopped. The silence stretched. Then, a single knock. From inside the gap, Lars bolted. He was out of his apartment in seconds, heart hammering against his ribs as he nearly stumbled into the hallway. The building smelled like dust and something vaguely rotten, but he barely noticed. He needed answers, and he knew exactly who to ask. Apartment 2B, Mrs. Vang. Lars hesitated outside her door before knocking. No answer. He knocked again. This time, slow shuffling footsteps crept toward the door. A chain slid, a lock clicked, and the door cracked open just an inch. A single, cloudy eye peered through the gap. "You heard it again," Mrs. Vang murmured. It wasn't a question. Lars exhaled, his hands still shaking. "Yeah," he admitted. I don't know what's going on in this place, but something's not right." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed and opened the door fully. Her apartment was immaculate, nothing like his. The floors were lined with salt, carefully poured along the doorways and windows. Strips of paper with strange symbols were tacked above each entrance. The air smelled of old incense and something herbal, almost medicinal. Lars stepped inside, feeling like he was crossing into another world. Mrs. Vang motioned toward the small wooden table in the corner. "Sit," she said. Lars obeyed. She shuffled to the kitchen, her robe whispering across the floor, and returned with 2 cups of tea. The liquid was dark, steaming. She pushed one toward him. Lars hesitated. Thanks." He took a cautious sip. It was bitter, but oddly soothing. Mrs. Vang sat across from him, fingers laced together, studying him like a puzzle she wasn't sure how to solve. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. Lars swallowed hard. "The thing in the hallway?" Mrs. Vang's face didn't change, but something in her shoulders stiffened. "You shouldn't have looked," she murmured. Lars blinked. "What?" She exhaled, setting her cup down. "The knocking. It always starts with the knocking." A cold shiver crawled down Lars's spine. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a small wooden box on the shelf behind her. Her frail hands unlatched the lid, pulling out a stack of old Polaroid photos. She slid the first one across the table. Lars hesitated before picking it up. It was a photo of his apartment door, but the number 2C was older, slightly different, like the plaque had been replaced over time. A tall, dark figure stood just outside the door. No features, no face, just a shape. Lars felt his pulse stutter. He flipped to the next photo. Another door, 1A this time. Same figure, same position. Next photo, 3D, then 4B, then 6C. Every photo was different, but the figure was always there, standing just outside someone's door. Lars's stomach clenched. "What happened to them?" he asked. Mrs. Vang's face was unreadable. "They left. She looked down at her hands. "Or they disappeared." Lars felt something heavy settle in his chest. "You need to listen to me, Lars," she said softly. "Do not open the door. No matter what you hear, no matter how much it knocks, do not answer." Lars swallowed. "And if I already did?" Mrs. Vang's expression darkened. "Then it knows you're there." A sick feeling twisted in his stomach. "And that means—" She hesitated before answering. "It means it won't stop." Lars left Mrs. Vang's apartment with more questions than answers. His thoughts felt scrambled, like a puzzle with missing pieces. As he stepped back into his own unit, his skin prickled with unease. Something was different. The air felt heavier, the silence too deep. Then he saw it, a piece of paper. It had been slipped under his door while he was gone. Lars bent down, heart hammering, and picked it up. The handwriting was shaky, scrawled in uneven black ink. "You are not alone." Lars felt his stomach drop. His eyes flicked to the peephole. For a split second, he swore he saw something move on the other side. But when he checked, the hallway was empty. Completely, utterly empty. And then, from somewhere inside the apartment, knock, knock, knock. Lars stared at the note in his trembling hands. "You are not alone." The words were written in uneven, jagged strokes, as if the writer's hand had been shaking. The ink had smudged in places, bleeding into the cheap paper like it had been clutched too tightly. His first instinct was to check the peephole again, but something inside him hesitated. If the hallway was empty, then fine. But if it wasn't, if something was out there, standing just beyond the door, waiting, a chill ran up his spine. Instead, he turned the note over, hoping for more. Nothing. Just blank space. Lars exhaled slowly and let the paper drift onto the counter. Maybe it was some sick joke from one of the neighbors. Maybe Mrs. Vang was messing with him to scare him into leaving. Maybe. Knock, knock, knock. Lars froze. The sound wasn't coming from the door. This time, it came from the wall that separated his apartment from 2D. Lars had never actually met the couple next door, Rayleigh and Colt. He'd heard them, though. Loud arguments through the walls, muffled laughter late at night, the occasional thud of something heavy being dropped or thrown. But last night it had been dead silent, too silent. And now he pressed a palm against the wall, listening. The knock hadn't come again. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe. Knock, knock, knock. Lars yanked his hand back like he'd been burned. What the hell was going on? Against his better judgment, he moved to his front door and very slowly unlatched the lock. The heavy wood creaked slightly as he pulled it open, and the dim yellow hallway stretched before him, unchanged. Nothing seemed out of place. Then his eyes landed on apartment 2D. The door was open, just a crack. A sliver of darkness peered from inside. Lars swallowed hard. Nope, 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 absolutely not. His instincts screamed at him to go back inside, to lock his door and pretend he saw nothing. But another part of him, the part that had always been too damn curious for his own good, needed to know. Carefully, he stepped into the hallway and approached 2D. The silence pressed against his ears, thick and heavy. With a trembling hand, he reached out and pushed the door open. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Not rot, not mildew, not anything specific. Just a deep, suffocating wrongness in the air, like the space itself had been drained of something vital. The apartment looked untouched. The kitchen table still had a half-eaten plate of food, the fork resting beside it as if someone had just paused mid-bite. A sweater was draped over the couch. A pair of shoes sat by the door, perfectly aligned. But there were no people. Rayleigh, Lars called hesitantly. Cold. Nothing. He took another cautious step inside, the floorboards creaking beneath him. A soft click echoed behind him. Lars spun around. The door had closed by itself. His pulse kicked into overdrive. No, no, absolutely not. He turned, reaching for the handle. A faint whisper slid through the apartment. Lars's breath hitched. It was so quiet, so subtle, that he almost convinced himself he imagined it. But then he heard it again. A hushed, breathy murmur coming from the bedroom. Lars's whole body went cold. He turned his head toward the hallway leading to the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Darkness pooled beyond it, thick and unmoving. Get out, his brain screamed. But his feet carried him forward. Every step felt heavier. The walls felt tighter, the ceiling lower. He reached the door and pushed it open. The bedroom was empty. The bed was unmade, the blankets tangled in a heap. A glass of water sat on the nightstand, untouched, a thin layer of dust settling on its surface. But Lars's attention was drawn to the closet. The doors were slightly ajar. Deep scratch marks lined the inside. Long, jagged gashes tore through the wood, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw its way out. Lars swallowed hard. The whispering was gone. The apartment was dead silent. And then, the closet door creaked open an inch wider. Lars's heart slammed into his ribs. A cold breath brushed against his cheek. He turned instantly. No one was there. The room was empty. His chest heaved, his throat tightening. He had to leave. Now, ignoring every nerve in his body screaming for him to run, he bolted back through the apartment, yanking the front door open and stumbling into the hallway. He turned, slamming the door behind him, and that's when he saw it. A single handprint, pressed against the inside of the door, too high to belong to Rayleigh or Colt, fingers too long. Lars backed away. He needed to get out of this building. Lars barely remembered making it to the supermarket. He needed air, needed to be around people, something to shake off the feeling that he'd walked too close to something he wasn't supposed to see. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he wandered aimlessly through the aisles, his basket empty. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Food? Supplies? A sense of normalcy? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, a woman standing near the frozen food section, staring at him. She looked off. Her skin was pale, almost grey under the supermarket lighting. Her eyes were too wide, too unblinking. She was wearing a thin black sweater despite the warm temperature. Lars hesitated. He didn't know her, had never seen her before, but something about her felt familiar. She took a step forward. Lars took a step back. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to speak. But before she could, the store intercom crackled, cutting through the silence. With the owner of a black Toyota, license plate 8XJ, Lars glanced toward the ceiling. Just a split second. But when he looked back, she was gone, vanished. Lars's pulse kicked up. He scanned the aisles, turning in place. Nowhere. He could still feel her eyes on him. He dropped his empty basket and left the store. Lars barely remembered making it to the supermarket. He needed air, needed to be around people, something to shake off the feeling that he'd walked too close to something he wasn't supposed to see. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he wandered aimlessly through the aisles, his basket empty. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Food? Supplies? A sense of normalcy? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, a woman standing near the frozen food section, staring at him. She looked off. Her skin was pale, almost grey under the supermarket lighting. Her eyes were too wide, too unblinking. She was wearing a thin black sweater despite the warm temperature. Lars hesitated. He didn't know her, had never seen her before, but something about her felt familiar. She took a step forward. Lars took a step back. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to speak. But before she could, the store intercom crackled, cutting through the silence. With the owner of a black Toyota, license plate 8XJ, Lars glanced toward the ceiling. Just a split second. But when he looked back, she was gone, vanished. Lars's pulse kicked up. He scanned the aisles, turning in place. Nowhere. He could still feel her eyes on him. He dropped his empty basket and left the store. By the time Lars stepped back into Holloway Arms, night had already settled over the building. The hallway was dim, the single overhead light casting long, stretching shadows against the walls. Mrs. Vang's door was shut. Apartment 2D was still quiet. Lars hesitated outside his own door, his stomach twisting into knots. He didn't want to go inside, but he had nowhere else to go. With a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped in. His apartment was exactly as he had left it. The couch, the fridge, the note on the counter. But there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. A footprint, right in the center of his living room carpet, wet, leading from the baseboard gap. Lars's breath caught in his throat. His whole body locked up, rigid with fear. Then, from inside the apartment, knock, knock, knock. The footprint on the carpet glistened under the dim overhead light. A perfect, wet imprint, human-shaped, but wrong. The arch was too high, the toes too long. The shape of it suggested bare skin, but the moisture it left behind was murky, almost oily, as if whatever made it had crawled out of something it shouldn't have. Lars's breath sat like a rock in his chest. He stood frozen in the doorway, unable to step inside. Every muscle in his body screamed, "Don't move." The air in his apartment felt heavy, thick, like the atmosphere had shifted into something denser, more suffocating. Then, a sound. Soft, wet, dripping. It was coming from the kitchen. Lars's hands clenched into fists. He didn't want to look, but he had to. Step by step, Lars moved forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence was thick, too thick. It filled his ears, stretching the moment unbearably. The dripping continued, slow and steady. As he reached the kitchen entrance, he forced himself to look. His sink was full of water, dark, murky, almost black. The surface was perfectly still except for the slow, rhythmic drip from the faucet. Drip, drip, drip. Lars's stomach turned. He hadn't left the sink running, hadn't used it at all today. He took another step closer, staring into the water. Something shifted beneath the surface. His breath hitched. A ripple spread outward, then another, and then, very slowly, a single bubble rose to the surface and popped, like something was breathing underneath. Lars stumbled back, knocking into the counter. The impact sent a glass shattering to the floor, the noise exploding in the quiet. His chest heaved. He had to get out, right now. His legs carried him toward the door before his brain even caught up, his hand fumbling for the lock. But then he saw it. A new note had been slipped under his door. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting jagged and erratic. Lars picked it up with trembling fingers and read the words. "We see you." His stomach dropped. Something shifted behind him. A soft creak of floorboards. Right in the center of the living room. Lars turned his head. Slowly, too slowly. The footprint was gone. Lars didn't sleep that night. He sat on his couch with every light in the apartment on, his eyes fixed on the front door, waiting. But nothing else happened. No more knocks. No more wet footprints. No more whispers from the dark. By the time morning came, he had only one thought. I need to talk to Mrs. Vang. He stepped into the hallway, locking his door behind him. Apartment 2B stood silent. Lars knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. A knot twisted in his gut. She was here yesterday. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. Silence. Then, very faintly, a sound, like something shifting inside. "Mrs. Vang," he called. No response. His pulse quickened. He reached for the doorknob and turned it. It wasn't locked. Lars hesitated. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed the door open. The first thing he noticed was the smell. It was thick, pungent, like burnt incense and something metallic. The air hummed, as if the room itself was vibrating at a frequency just beyond human perception. Mrs. Vang's apartment looked different from the last time he had been inside. The strips of paper with symbols were torn from the walls, scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The salt lines at the doorways had been smeared, broken, like something had stepped through them. Lars's stomach tightened. Mrs. Vang. No answer. The apartment was empty. Lars took a slow step forward. The wooden box she had shown him yesterday, the one with the old Polaroids, was tipped over on the floor. A few photos spilled out, some face up. His own door was in one of them, but something had changed. The photo of apartment 2C now showed the door wide open, and something was standing inside. Something long-limbed, hunched, barely visible in the darkness. Lars felt a sharp, prickling sensation crawl up the back of his neck. He bent down, carefully picking up another photo. This one was blurred, almost like the camera had moved when the picture was taken. But he could still make out the shape in the hallway. Tall, still, facing the door, facing his door. Lars swallowed hard. His eyes darted around the apartment. Mrs. Vang was gone. But where? His hands clenched into fists. He didn't like this. Didn't like any of this. And then, a new sound. Soft knocking. Not from his apartment this time. From 2D. The empty apartment. Lars's body locked up. Then, as if in response, the door to 2D creaked open. Lars backed away from 2B, stepping into the hallway. The door to 2D was open now, just like it had been last night. Only this time, something was standing in the doorway. A shape. A figure. Tall. Too tall. Its head was nearly brushing the ceiling. Its arms were too long, hanging limply at its sides, fingers almost scraping the floor. Its eyes. Oh God. Its eyes were missing. Just empty sockets, deep and black, like something had scooped them out. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, staring without eyes. Lars's pulse exploded in his ears. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. And then, the thing raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and it pointed at him. A sound slithered through the hallway, low, garbled, like a voice speaking underwater. Lars's throat clenched shut. The thing took a step forward. Lars didn't wait. He turned and bolted. He didn't stop running until he was back inside his apartment. The door slammed and locked behind him. His chest heaved, every muscle trembling. He pressed his back against the door, forcing himself to breathe. Silence. Then, a rustling sound. He looked down. A new note had been slipped under his door. Lars's breath caught in his throat. This one wasn't written in ink. It was scratched into the paper, the letters uneven and shaky. With a trembling hand, he picked it up and read the words. Don't look at it. His hands went numb, and then, from behind him, a wet breath against his neck. Too late. The breath on Lars's neck was cold. Not the kind of cold you get from winter air or an open window. This was wrong. A damp, decaying chill that settled into his skin, sinking deep into his bones. It felt wet, like something was exhaling mist onto his flesh. His stomach twisted. Something was behind him. Lars didn't turn. Couldn't. Every nerve in his body screamed, don't move. But the thing moved first. A slow, shuddering inhale. A deep, guttural breath, dragging into the still air of the apartment. And then, a whisper. Lars. The voice wasn't human. It was garbled, warped, like someone speaking underwater. Lars's entire body locked up. His mind tried to deny what he had just heard. He hadn't told anyone his name in this building except Mrs. Vang, and she was gone. How did it know? The air behind him shifted. Something moved. And that's when Lars ran. He didn't think. Didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in, sending him lunging for the door. His fingers fumbled at the lock. His breathing came in sharp, panicked bursts. His hands were slick with sweat. Behind him, something shifted. Lars could hear the faintest scrape of nails against the wood. Click. The lock slid free. Lars yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway. He turned, ready to slam it shut, but his apartment was empty. No shadow, no shape, nothing. Just his living room, his kitchen, his empty bed. But the note was gone. The one that had been on the floor just moments ago. The one that said, "Don't look at it." Lars's stomach twisted. His gaze flicked up. And that's when he noticed something else was missing. The wet footprint. Lars stood in the hallway, heart hammering, trying to catch his breath. The flickering overhead buzzed faintly, casting long, jittery shadows against the walls. Everything looked the same, except his apartment door. The number plaque, 2C, was gone. Not removed, not torn off. It was like it had never been there at all. Patch of smooth, undisturbed wood sat where the number should have been. Lars swallowed hard. His fingers reached out and traced the spot where it had once been. His door wasn't his door anymore. A slow, creeping realization crawled into his brain, wrapping its cold fingers around his spine. Was it possible that he had... No, that was insane. This was his apartment. He had just been inside. He had just left. Right. A sound echoed down the hallway. Soft. Muffled. It came from apartment 2A. The apartment on the other side of him. The one that had been empty since he moved in. Lars turned slowly. The door to 2A was open. Just a crack. A sliver of darkness peeked through the gap, deep and waiting. Lars's breath hitched. He should have walked away, should have turned around, gone to the lobby, left the damn building. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer. The door swung open without a sound. The moment Lars crossed the threshold, the air changed. Everything in 2A felt wrong. The walls were the same beige as his own unit, but here they were stripped bare, exposing patches of old, yellowed plaster. The carpet was damp, the fibers clinging to his shoes as he stepped forward. There was no furniture, no couch, no bed, no kitchen table, just an empty space. Except Lars's eyes landed on something in the middle of the living room floor. A chair, a single wooden chair, facing the wall. His stomach tightened. Something about it made his skin crawl, like it was waiting for someone or something. Lars swallowed hard. His breath felt loud in the silence. Then a faint creak. His head snapped toward the sound. The closet door. It was open. Barely. Just an inch. A sliver of absolute darkness stretched beyond it. Lars took a step back, pulse pounding. Nope. Absolutely not. But before he could leave, he saw something else. The walls. They weren't empty. They were covered in scratches. Deep, jagged gashes that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. Some were old, faded into the plaster like scars. Others were fresh, the cuts sharp and angry. And then Lars saw the writing. The words, scratched into the walls over and over. "Let me in." His stomach turned. And that's when he noticed the door. The one on the far side of the apartment. It wasn't like the front door. It wasn't like any door in the building. It was older. The wood was splintered, the handle rusted, like it hadn't been opened in years. Lars didn't want to go near it, didn't want to acknowledge it, but he had already made the mistake of looking at it. And now he could feel it, the thing on the other side. It was waiting, watching, and then the doorknob turned. Lars ran. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He just bolted back through the empty apartment, back into the hallway, back toward where his door should have been. But when he reached it, his apartment was gone. The door to 2C wasn't there anymore. Instead, the numbers on the door read 6A. Lars's blood turned to ice. He spun around, searching for something, anything familiar. But the hallway was different. The wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips. The lights weren't flickering anymore. They were off. A deep, suffocating darkness settled over everything. And then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming from the end of the hall. Lars turned, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was there, the same one he had seen in 2D, the tall thing with no eyes. But this time, it was closer. It took another step. The sound echoed down the hallway, thick and wet, like something walking through water. Lars backed up, heart pounding. His hands scrambled for the door handle, trying to open something, anything, just to get out of here. But before he could, the figure tilted its head, and in a voice too warped to be human, it spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." Lars's vision blurred. His chest tightened, and then everything went black. Lars woke up to the sound of dripping water. His head pounded. His body ached. His skin felt damp, like he had been lying somewhere cold and wet for too long. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open. The world was wrong. He wasn't in the hallway anymore. He was back in his apartment. But something was off. The furniture was in the same place. The light in the kitchen still buzzed faintly. The door to his bedroom stood slightly ajar, just as he had left it. But the air felt different. Thicker, heavier, like the atmosphere had shifted into something just slightly out of sync with reality. Lars forced himself to sit up, rubbing his temples. His hands trembled. His shirt was soaked, but not with sweat, with water, the same murky, oily moisture from before. He wiped his hands on his jeans, breathing hard. What the hell had just happened? Had he imagined everything? The missing apartment door? The dark hallway? The thing that had spoken to him? His fingers instinctively reached for his phone, but it wasn't there. His stomach twisted. The coffee table was empty. His phone, his wallet, his keys, gone. A chill ran down his spine. Someone had been inside. Lars pushed himself to his feet, legs unsteady beneath him. His brain felt foggy, like he had just woken from a dream that refused to let go. He moved toward the door, his bare feet sinking slightly into the carpet. Something felt different about the floor, like it was softer than before, like he wasn't walking on carpet at all. The thought made his stomach turn, so he shoved it aside and unlocked the door. The hallway stretched before him, silent and dim. The overhead light flickered, humming in slow, irregular pulses. Lars turned toward Mrs. Vang's apartment and stopped. The door to 2B was wide open. His pulse spiked. "Mrs. Vang," he called softly. No answer. He took a cautious step forward, and then a voice, soft, wet, from deep inside the apartment. "Come in." Lars froze. It didn't sound like Mrs. Vang. It sounded off, like someone trying to mimic her voice, but getting all the human parts wrong. Like a recording played at the wrong speed. Slow, garbled, dripping. His skin crawled. Then he saw it. A shadow. A shape moving inside the apartment, just beyond the doorway. It wasn't human-shaped. Lars's breath caught. He turned on his heel and bolted back to his apartment. Lars slammed the door behind him, chest heaving. His body felt like it was trying to shut down, like his heart was beating too fast for his ribs to contain it. Then, a sound, soft, rustling. Something had been slid under his door. Lars swallowed hard. He bent down slowly, his fingers brushing against a small, worn package. The wrapping was old paper, yellowed at the edges, soft from moisture. No writing, no address, just an unmarked cassette tape resting inside. Lars stared at it. He hadn't owned a cassette player in years, but he knew who might. The lobby of Holloway Arms was as lifeless as ever. A dim, narrow space with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, and a small wooden counter where the landlord, Mr. Greaves, supposedly worked. Lars had never seen him. Not once. No one had. But someone had to be slipping those notes under his door. Someone had to be watching. Behind the counter, a door stood slightly ajar, revealing a dark office beyond it. The landlord's office. Lars hesitated. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Old paper, stale air, something faintly metallic. The room was small, cluttered with filing cabinets and stacks of yellowed documents. But Lars's eyes locked onto one thing, an old cassette player, sitting right in the middle of the desk, waiting. Lars's hands shook as he picked up the cassette and slid it into the player. A click, a soft, static-filled hiss. Then, a sound, knocking. Lars's breath caught. A slow, rhythmic knock-knock-knock filled the room, muffled and distorted. It sounded like it had been recorded from inside an apartment. The knocking repeated, again and again. Then, a voice. "Let me in." Lars's stomach dropped. The voice was familiar. It was his own voice, whispering from the tape. Static crackled. Then another sound. Something moving, something shifting. And then the voice again, but different this time. Warped. Wrong. I'm already inside. The tape cut out. Lars ripped it from the player, hands trembling. His mind raced. That wasn't possible. That wasn't possible. He turned to leave, and then he saw them. The filing cabinets. One was slightly open, old documents spilling out. Lars reached for a folder. His breath hitched. Inside were tenant records, dozens of names, addresses, apartment numbers. But every single one of them had the same note beside it. Missing. Lars flipped through frantically. One name caught his eye. Mrs. Vang. Missing since 1987. Lars's stomach turned to ice. He had just spoken to her. She had been standing in front of him, holding a cup of tea. She had given him photos. How could she have been missing for 37 years? A soft click echoed behind him. Lars turned. The office door had closed, and in the reflection of the old dust-covered window, something stood behind him. Lars's chest seized. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The reflection was tall, thin. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. No eyes, no mouth, just a dark, featureless face staring at him through the glass. Lars's pulse exploded. He spun around. The office was empty. The air felt thick, suffocating. The only sound was the faint hiss of the cassette player. Then a knock, soft, deliberate, coming from inside the filing cabinet. Lars staggered back. The cabinet door shuddered. Something was inside, and it was trying to get out. Lars ran. Lars didn't stop until he was back in his apartment. The door locked and barricaded. His chest heaved. His mind raced. What the hell was happening in this building? The notes, the tape, the missing tenants. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last thing he had taken from the landlord's office. A photo. A grainy Polaroid of his own apartment door. But the numbers on the plaque weren't 2C. They were 6A. The same number he had seen in the hallway. The same number that wasn't supposed to exist. And then he saw it. A single word scratched into the bottom of the photo. A warning. Don't answer the door. And then, knock, knock, knock. The knock sent a sharp bolt of terror through Lars's chest. Not because of the sound itself. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the wood. But because of where it was coming from. Not the front door. Not the walls. Not even the baseboard gap in the kitchen. It was inside. Coming from the bedroom closet. Lars's body locked up. A deep, bone-deep wrongness filled the apartment, like the air had been sucked out and replaced with something thick and waiting. He barely breathed. The knock came again. Knock, knock, knock. He turned his head slowly toward the bedroom door. It was open just a crack. The closet was hidden beyond the sliver of darkness. Lars's pulse pounded in his ears. The knock hadn't come from the front this time. It had come from inside the closet, like something was knocking from the other side. Of what? Lars didn't want to know. But then, a whisper. So soft, so low, he barely heard it. But it was there, and it said his name. Lars. Lars did something he shouldn't have. Something he would regret for the rest of his life. He knocked back. 1, 2, 3. As soon as his knuckles tapped against the bedroom wall, the air shifted. The apartment felt smaller. The temperature dropped. Something was different now. Something had changed. The closet door creaked open. Lars's breath caught in his throat. The gap was only an inch, just enough to see utter blackness beyond it. Not the usual darkness of an unlit closet. This was deeper, thicker, like the absence of light was a living thing. Then, from inside the closet, a slow, heavy inhale. Something was breathing in. Lars's skin prickled all over. The breath was wrong. It didn't sound like lungs filling. It sounded wet, like something was learning to breathe. Lars backed away. He moved toward the bathroom, his body moving before his brain could catch up. He slammed the door and flipped on the light, the bulb buzzing harshly overhead. His reflection stared back at him from the mirrored medicine cabinet. His own face. Wide, terrified eyes. Sweat beading along his temple. He gripped the sink, exhaling in shuddering bursts. But then, his reflection didn't move. For a second, Lars thought it was a trick of the light. But no, his reflection's chest wasn't rising and falling. It wasn't breathing. It just stood there, frozen, watching. And then, it smiled. Lars didn't smile, but his reflection did. A slow, wide, too-stretched grin splitting its face. Lars's stomach turned to ice. He stumbled back, hands gripping the walls, heart hammering. The reflection tilted its head. Not like a person, like a marionette with cut strings. And then it did something even worse. It knocked. 3 slow taps, directly against the other side of the mirror. Lars ran. Lars burst out of the bathroom, heart in his throat. The apartment was silent. Too silent. Even the low hum of the refrigerator was gone. The air felt vacant, as if he wasn't supposed to be here anymore, like something else had already taken his place. He checked the closet. The door was open now, wide open. The inside was empty, but the walls had changed. Scratches, deep, uneven scratches lined the inside of the closet. At the very bottom, near the floor, were 5 long gouges, like fingernail marks, as if someone had been dragged inside. A low, crawling dread settled into Lars's bones. Then he saw something else, something worse. The apartment door. It was open, not just unlocked, wide, open. The hallway stretched beyond it, impossibly dark. Lars's stomach twisted. He didn't leave the door open. He would never. A single wet footprint sat just beyond the doorway. Something had stepped inside. Something had let itself in. And then, from the hallway, a whisper. Lars. Lars moved without thinking. He grabbed his jacket, his shoes, his keys. Wait. His keys were gone. They had been right there, on the table. But now, the space was empty. His heart pounded. He turned back to the open door, and froze. Someone was standing in the hallway. At first, Lars thought it was a neighbor, but then he noticed the way it stood. Too still, too unnatural. Its arms hung limply, fingers almost touching the floor. The head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was wrong, not blurred, not shadowed, just wrong, like someone had tried to make a human face from memory and failed. Lars's lungs locked up. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing didn't speak. It didn't blink. It just stood there, watching. Then, it did the worst thing yet. It took a step forward. Lars ran. He didn't stop to think, didn't look back, didn't breathe until he hit the stairwell, his shoes slamming against the old, groaning steps. The hallway behind him was silent. No footsteps, no movement. But Lars felt it. Something was following him. Not running, not chasing, just moving toward him, step by step. Like it already knew where he was going. Like it didn't need to rush. Lars hit the lobby, his breath ragged. But the moment he pushed through the doors, the world changed. The city was gone. The streets, the cars, the buildings, everything wasn't there. Instead, an endless hallway stretched in front of him. The walls were peeling. The air was thick. And every single door lining the corridor looked exactly like his apartment door. Lars's stomach dropped. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. He turned and slammed into something solid, something tall. His breath caught. The thing was standing right in front of him now. Its head tilted slowly. It raised one hand and pressed a single cold finger against his forehead. Everything went dark, and in the silence, Lars heard the last thing he ever wanted to hear. A soft, slow whisper. Now you're inside. Lars awoke to silence. A silence so deep it felt alive, pressing against his ears, wrapping around his throat. He didn't open his eyes right away. Something in his gut told him not to. Told him that if he did, if he looked at where he was, the world might not be the same anymore. And then, slowly, he realized he was standing, not lying down, not in his bed, not on the floor. His body was upright, still, frozen, like he had been placed somewhere. A sharp, cold fear coiled in his stomach. Something was wrong. The air around him felt thicker than it should have been. It pressed against his skin, humming faintly, like the walls themselves were breathing. And then he heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, not footsteps, not breathing, something else, something moving toward him. Lars's body locked up. His brain screamed, "Don't look," but it was already too late. His eyes opened, and he saw where he was. It wasn't his apartment. It wasn't Holloway Arms. It wasn't even the outside world. Lars stood in the middle of a long, stretching hallway, lined with identical apartment doors. Each one was his. The same beige paint, the same brass doorknob, the same warped peephole. But none of them were real. They stretched into infinity, disappearing into the dark. The walls breathed faintly, like something was shifting beneath the surface, unseen. The air was thick with moisture. Dripping sounds echoed from somewhere deep inside the hall, their source unknown. And then he felt it, the presence, not behind him, not in front of him, but to his right, inside the closest door, inside one of the false apartments. Something was inside, watching him. Lars's chest tightened. His eyes flicked toward the door. It was cracked open, a sliver of darkness beyond it. A feeling settled over him, something old, something patient. Whatever was in there had been waiting for him, and now it knew he was here. Lars took a step back. The floor sank slightly beneath his foot, like he wasn't walking on wood, like the floor itself was something soft and breathing. His pulse pounded. A soft creak echoed from inside the open door. Something moved. Lars's hands clenched into fists. Then a whisper, not in his head, not in the air. From the peephole, a voice, distorted and low, curling through the tiny brass circle. "I see you." Lars's entire body locked up. His breath came fast, sharp, ragged, and then a finger slid through the peephole. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A thin, pale finger, pushing through, bending at an unnatural angle, reaching for him. Lars stumbled back, heart slamming against his ribs. The finger twitched, then slowly withdrew, and from inside the apartment, the door began to open wider. Lars turned and ran. His feet slammed against the hallway floor as he sprinted past rows and rows of identical doors. Each one was his. Each one had a peephole. Each one had something standing behind it, watching, waiting. Lars didn't look. He didn't dare. He just ran. Then something changed. One of the doors swung open by itself, directly in his path. Too fast to stop, Lars tumbled inside. The door slammed shut behind him. The apartment was identical to his. The same furniture, the same layout, but something was off. The colors were drained, like an old, faded photograph, washed out and dying. The air smelled damp, like something had been rotting in here for too long. Lars swallowed hard. Something was wrong with this place. Then, slowly, he noticed the walls. They were covered in scratches, deep, frantic gashes, some long, some jagged, some desperate. Fingernail marks, like someone had been trapped in here, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Lars's breath hitched. Then he saw something even worse, something that made his entire body go numb. There was a mirror on the wall, and in the reflection, he wasn't alone. Lars's stomach dropped. The reflection wasn't right. It was him, but it wasn't. The other Lars stood in the mirror, grinning. His eyes were too dark. His fingers were too long. His smile was stretched too wide. Lars took a slow step back. The reflection didn't move. It just stared. And then it knocked. Knock, knock, knock. From inside the mirror, Lars's throat clenched. His legs screamed at him to run, but he was paralyzed. And then the reflection stepped forward, not in the mirror, out of it. Its foot touched the floor, and suddenly the air cracked, like a broken radio signal. The walls rippled. Lars staggered back. The other Lars smiled wider. Its mouth stretched too far, splitting at the edges. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have knocked." Lars bolted for the door. Lars yanked the door open and stumbled back into the hallway. His lungs burned. The hallway was different now. The walls were warping. The lights above him flickered, buzzing like insects trapped in glass. And then he saw him, the man in the hallway, standing at the far end, motionless, watching. Lars's breath hitched. The thing didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, waiting. Then it tilted its head and took one step forward. Lars ran. Lars sprinted through the twisting corridors, desperately searching for a way out. The hallway kept changing. The walls blurred. The floors felt softer, like something was breathing beneath them. Then he saw it. A single door at the very end of the corridor, different from the rest. Old. Familiar. His door. Apartment 2C. Lars's chest heaved. He lunged for it, grabbing the handle with both hands, twisting. The door swung open. His apartment. The real one. The air smelled right. The light was normal. He had made it. Lars stumbled inside and slammed the door shut. His hands shook. His knees buckled. He was home. Everything was fine. Then, from the other side of the door, a whisper. "Who's there?" Lars's blood turned to ice, because the voice was his. Lars froze. The whisper from the other side of the door slid into his ears like an oil-slicked hand, curling around his brain, seeping into his thoughts. It was his own voice, soft, calm, curious. "Who's there?" The words were so casual, so gently spoken, like a friend answering the phone. But Lars knew. It wasn't him. His back pressed against the door. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. He reached out with one shaking hand and locked the deadbolt. Click. Silence. Then, from behind him, inside his apartment, a whisper. "That won't help." Lars spun around. The apartment looked the same. The couch, the coffee table, the flickering light in the kitchen. But something was off. The air felt wrong. It smelled different, damp, like rain-soaked concrete, and something else, something faintly rotten. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Had it always smelled like that? Had he just not noticed? Or was this not his apartment? Lars backed toward the wall, pulse racing. Then the whisper came again, this time from the bathroom. "Come look." Lars's stomach twisted. The door was cracked open. A sliver of darkness stretched beyond it, just enough to see the mirror. And in the mirror, someone was standing there. Not him. Not him. The figure was facing the wall. Its back was hunched. Its arms were too long. Its fingers twitched slightly, hanging limply by its sides. And then, slowly, it turned its head. Not its body, just its head. A slow, unnatural twist. Lars ran. He hit the door and threw it open, stumbling into the hallway. The overhead light flickered, buzzing too loudly, like flies trapped in a bulb. He needed to get out. He needed to get out now. The stairs. He bolted for them, bare feet slapping against the floor. The stairwell yawned open before him, dark, empty. Lars grabbed the railing and took the steps 2 at a time. Down, down, down. But after 3 flights, he was still on the 2nd floor. His breath hitched. His stomach dropped. He turned and saw the hallway stretched out before him. The same hallway, the same apartment doors, as if he had never moved at all. Then, a sound, soft, familiar. Knock, knock, knock. Lars turned his head slowly. The knock had come from one of the apartment doors, not his. 2B, Mrs. Vang's apartment. The door was open, just a crack. A thin line of blackness peered through the gap. Lars's stomach twisted. She was missing. She had been missing since 1987. And yet, he had seen her yesterday. She had spoken to him, warned him, given him the photographs. Hadn't she? Hadn't she? Lars took a slow step forward. Inside the darkness, something shifted. A whisper curled out from the black. You should have left. Then, the door slammed shut, and from inside, a long, inhuman scream. Lars ran. He didn't know where he was going anymore. The hallway stretched on, warping, twisting, refusing to end. Doors blinked in and out of existence. The wallpaper peeled away in strips, revealing something beneath it, something that pulsed. Then, his own apartment door appeared in front of him, 2C. Except, the number was wrong. Someone had scratched over it. Deep, jagged marks had cut through the metal, carving a new message into the door. Who's there? Lars's skin crawled. He took a slow step back, and then something moved behind him. Something tall, something breathing. The air turned wet and heavy. A slow, rasping inhale. Lars didn't turn around. He knew what was there. The thing from the hallway. The thing that had pointed at him. The thing that had spoken with his voice. And now, it was standing directly behind him. A single, cold finger touched the back of his neck. Lars jerked forward. The door swung open by itself, and Lars fell inside. Lars hit the ground hard. His head spun. The floor beneath him was wet, sticky. The air smelled rotted, thick with decay. He pushed himself up slowly, and then he saw them. The photographs. Hundreds of them, scattered across the floor. All of them were pictures of his door, all taken from inside the hallway. But in each one, the door was open a little wider, further, further, until, in the last one, it was fully open, and something was stepping through. Lars's breath hitched. Something moved in the dark. A figure. Long arms. No face. Too many fingers. Lars scrambled backward. The thing took a step forward. Another. Another. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it had waited long enough, like it had finally been invited in. Lars's mouth opened to scream, but the thing raised one long, skeletal finger and pressed it to where its lips should have been. A shushing motion. And then, in a voice distorted, waterlogged, wrong, it whispered, "Who's there?" The door slammed shut, and Lars was gone. Lars was falling, not down, not in any direction he could understand. The world had dropped away beneath him. There was no ground, no ceiling, no walls, just a vast, endless nothing. And in that nothing, he could feel it. Something was waiting. Something was watching. Then, a voice, low, distant, not his own, not human. It spoke a single word, curling through the void like an echo from the bottom of a deep, black ocean. Stay. And Lars stopped falling. His feet hit the floor. The world came back all at once, snapping into focus like a broken film reel jamming back into place. He was somewhere new. A room, if it could even be called that. The walls were wrong. They were too high, too narrow, stretching endlessly upward. The floor beneath him wasn't solid. It felt like carpet, but wet, like something had soaked through it from underneath. The air smelled wrong, damp, metallic, like an open wound left in the rain. Lars's heart pounded. He turned slowly, taking in his surroundings. There were no windows, no doors, just an empty chair in the middle of the room, and on the wall across from him, a peephole, identical to the one in his apartment door. Lars's stomach twisted. This place wasn't real. It couldn't be. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the other side of the wall. Lars's breath hitched. Something was out there. Something that had knocked first. Something that was waiting for him to look. He took a slow step forward. Then another. The peephole loomed larger in his vision. A tiny, round opening into the unknown. His hands were shaking. His body screamed not to do it. But Lars leaned in and looked. At first, there was only darkness. Thick, heavy, endless. Then something moved. A shift in the black. Not light, not shadow. Something alive. And then a single eye blinked open. Lars's chest seized. It was massive, far too big for a human face. The iris was grey, dull, like a dead thing staring back at him. And yet, it saw him. It knew him. Lars staggered back. The air in the room shifted. The walls groaned. The chair in the center of the room creaked, tilting slightly. And then, something else knocked. From inside the walls. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, patient, like something wanted out. Lars's breath came fast, ragged. He turned to run, and the walls split open. The wall behind the chair peeled apart. Not like a door, not like anything built by human hands. It opened like skin. The layers pulled back, revealing a space beyond it. A hallway that looked exactly like Holloway arms. The flickering yellow light, the faded carpet, the row of identical doors. But Lars knew better now. This wasn't his building. This was something else. Something that had been copying it. And then it stepped through. The tall thing. The man in the hallway. It moved slowly, unfolding itself from the darkness like a puppet with cut strings. Its limbs were too long. Its face was wrong. Not featureless, but unfinished. Like something had tried to make a person from memory and gotten the details slightly wrong. It looked at Lars and smiled. A slow, stretched grin, too wide, splitting the skin of its face. It raised one hand and pointed at him. "You opened the door," it said. Its voice was his own. Lars's pulse exploded. He ran. Lars hit the hallway at full speed. His bare feet slammed against the floor as he sprinted past door after door after door. All of them looked like his apartment. All of them were wrong. The numbers kept changing. 4B, 1A, 6C, backwards, out of order, repeating. Then, one of the doors swung open. Not his, Mrs. Vang's. Lars's chest tightened. She had warned him. She had told him not to open the door. And now she was gone. Lars turned to run past, but something inside moved. A whisper curled out from the blackness. "You can't leave." Lars bolted. The hallway finally ended. A door stood at the far end, a single wooden exit door. He burst through it, gasping for breath, and found himself in the lobby. But it wasn't right. The front desk was covered in dust. The air smelled stale, abandoned. The lights flickered like dying stars. Lars stumbled forward. The front entrance was open. Beyond it, the outside world. Not endless hallways, not flickering lights. Just a dark, empty street. Lars's heart pounded. He was almost out. Then, a whisper. From behind him. Lars. Lars turned and saw himself.
He stood just a few feet away. Same clothes, same face, but his eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark. A smile curled his lips. The other Lars tilted his head. "You don't belong out there," he whispered. Lars's hands shook. His body screamed at him to run, but his double took a slow step forward. "You're supposed to be inside." Another step. "This is where you live now." Another. Lars backed toward the door. His foot hit the threshold, and suddenly, he understood. This was a choice. If he stayed, if he let himself believe the hallway was real, he'd never get out. But if he left, would something take his place? Would he ever be safe? The other Lars smiled wider and whispered, "Who's there?" Lars ran. His body hit the pavement. Cold air slammed into his lungs. The street was real. The city was real. Behind him, the door to Holloway arms shut by itself. A slow, creaking sound, like something closing its mouth. Lars turned. The building stood silent. No flickering lights, no whispers, no hallway that wouldn't end. Just an old, abandoned apartment complex, like it had been empty for years. Lars's breath shook. He backed away, step by step by step, and then, from behind the door, a final whisper, soft, faint. "See you soon." Lars ran, and never looked back.